All right, let's stay with the story and speak to UJ Center for Africa-China Studies, Koffi Kouakou, who joins us live now. Thank you so much for your time. Your initial thoughts as you see developments in Gabon?
Well, this is really some kind of, I wouldn't say quite a big surprise to a certain degree, but it's got a very interesting twist to it because it's not a coup that has blood in it, almost like the other coups. They're bloodless coups. It's a really, my initial thought by having watched this video of the deposed President Bongo, it's really sad to see how a dynasty, a family that's run a country for over half a century have managed to be, being kicked out like that, and the president pleading, in a desperate plea to ask people to help him to make noise. But what he's trying to save, of course, himself, his wife, his kids, and his family. But he forgets about the people he's been really ruling for now 14 years or more, wanted to go for a third term. That tells you a little bit of the kind of image we have about a president. I wouldn't extrapolate to other presidents, but leaders who have forgotten about what they need to do in Africa to help to change the nature and the condition of the countries. And especially for a country like Gabon, so wealthy, fourth producer of oil and gas in Africa, small population, but at least, 2.5 million people. They've got to do something. They haven't done it, and this is the consequences of it.
And that particular wealth, sadly, also not translating to the many men and women that he leads.
Indeed. I mean, it's really, you have a group of an elite that's been monopolizing the wealth of the country. I mean, to be the fourth producer of oil in Africa, this is a lot of money, a lot of resources. Beside oil, Gabon is also rich in natural resources. They have one of the most incredible, unique, and pristine rainforests. They've got a species of trees there that's perhaps one of the most expensive in the world, that's been harvested by many European countries, but also now by China. And so that wealth hasn't trickled down, hasn't been distributed enough, and it's really inexcusable.
And looking at, what has been happening in the so-called former French colonies, and how it's hogged the headlines recently, and, these coups being talked about the world over, what are they telling us?
Well, I've been talking to many of my colleagues and observers. Somebody has coined a new phrase called the francophone spring, or I also call it the Africa spring, which means things are just popping up literally in what's called the former French colonies. And the main thread there is really undeniable, the failure of post-colonial France's policy to have helped to keep these leaders in power and not even concerned about the rest of the population. And I think it's an indictment to the successive French government, not to the French people, but to the successive French government and the African elite that have been quietly not even talking or condemning or finding a way to solve these problems. It's not just an institutional problem, it's a systemic problem. And that systemic problem, Africans are now tired of it. They're having their grievances, and the militaries are taking advantage of it.
And I wonder, though, how much of a nightmare is it likely to be for France?
It is a huge nightmare, especially not just in terms of foreign policy, but just its international image, that not just suddenly, but, the trend is showing that out of its former French colonies, many of them using French as an official language, besides the fact that Mali just decided to chuck French, to make French not an official language anymore. It is clear that there's something wrong across the board, across not just the Sahel, but what is called francophone countries. And these military coups are now spreading. They are becoming contagious, and they will continue until there's a systemic solution to these African problems.
And it segues then to the next question. I mean, you listened, I'm sure, to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talking about getting to the root cause, to address the root causes of these particular problems. And he continues to say it's time for a robust African capacity to assess the security and risks. Do we have this capacity?
Well, sometimes it's a bit laughable. I don't want to be impolite to the Secretary General Guterres, but he's known this. He knows these kind of problems, and it's in public. They can say all they can't say about building African capacity. But if you look at it, in fact, these troops have failed across the Sahel, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, to kick out many of the to help stabilize really the terrorist situation. In fact, 13,000 troops of the UN troops will have to leave Mali, I think, this week or next week. I mean, that shows that they haven't been able to manage the situation well. Talking about, building these capacities when the UN have been in these countries for more than 10, 15, and even 20 years, especially in the DRC, it's really looking at us and thinking that many of us don't think much. It's not just about that. It's the structure of those colonial systems that are not working. And both in security, economic issues, military defense, and then, of course, education, and then other issues of infrastructure.
And one of the things, of course, as you know, we continue to watch what is happening in these particular countries. One is asking the question possibly tonight, what could be behind this? Is it a desperation for a better life for the citizens who feel that they've been failed? Is it the military trying to hog power? Or is there a force that we may not be seeing possibly at play here?
It's a combination of all of that. And there's really no mystery to this. The colonial legacy hasn't helped much because the link to the Franc CFA has been really destroying the monetary sovereignty of these countries to be able to use their own decision to spend the money where they have to send them. But also another one is that most of these countries are very indebted, and debt is also a very terrible instrument that hasn't helped most of these African governments that are using the little bit of reserve they have to pay the debts they own to international monetary funds, the World Bank, and then all these private investors. And this is going to have to change. If you remember, President Cyril Ramaphosa and many Africans were in Paris a couple of months ago attempting to negotiate finances and debt. This is how really it cripples Africa. But beside accusing African leaders always to be poorly understanding not understanding democratic issues, sometimes is missing the issue. The crisis is more systemic, which means until they get out of these systemic problems, they're not going to solve it. And the military are using that as a toolbox to really claim their position as well.
And it'll be interesting to see the developments in this particular story as, of course, it is a developing one, and watching to see what happens here. Let me thank you for your time tonight. Do appreciate it. That is UJ Center for Africa-China Studies, Koffi Kouakou.